Okay, so let's jump straight into the numbers, because there is a massive discrepancy here. Back in 2010, the Chinese yuan was used in almost 0% of China's own cross-border transactions, right? Fast forward to 2025, and that number is skyrocketed to 54%. Now that sounds incredibly impressive on paper, but despite that massive internal surge, the yuan's actual share of global foreign exchange reserves, it's a microscopic 2.12%.
The immense gap here is just wild when you stack the numbers side by side. We're talking about 2 decades of intense effort, the massive Belt and Road Initiative, countless BRICS summits, and the result is barely over 2%. Meanwhile, the US dollar still commands a totally dominant 57% share, with the euro sitting at 20%. So you have to wonder, why, after pouring more money into this effort than most countries have in their entire national treasuries, can't China close that gap? Well, the answer is probably not what you'd expect. Part 1. The Dollar Network Effect. Anatomy of a Reserve. To really grasp this, we need to quickly look back at the foundation laid in 1944 at Bretton Woods.
A lot of people assume the dollar is powerful just because America is rich. But actually, no, that's incorrect. It's powerful because of an 80-year-old financial system that simply has no global substitute. For a currency to be a true reserve, it's got to do 3 things flawlessly. It has to be a reliable medium of exchange for buying and selling, a universal unit of account for pricing things like oil and wheat, and a secure store of value for governments to hold their savings. The dollar is the ultimate triple threat. It does all 3 simultaneously, and it has for 8 decades.
And because it performs those functions so perfectly, it has built up this absolute fortress of a network effect. I mean, 89.9% of all global foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar. Think about that for a second. Even when a Japanese company buys oil from Saudi Arabia, they are highly likely converting yen to dollars, paying in dollars, and then Saudi Arabia converts those dollars to whatever they need. It's literally the English language of money. It traps everyone in a cycle of mutual reliance where the cost of switching is just impossibly high.
To put that kind of scale into perspective, the U.S. CIPS system processes an astronomical $1,800 billion every single day. By comparison, China's alternative system, CIPS, processes around 60 billion. That's not just a gap, that is an ocean. You simply cannot out-network an 80-year head start overnight.
Part 2. 5 failed attempts. The offensives. Now, China definitely hasn't been sitting idle. They've launched 5 major strategies over the past 2 decades.
But as we've seen in our past explainers, like the ones on ASML and NVIDIA, China keeps hitting hard structural limits. Let's run through these roadblocks. First, the Petroyuan. China tried to get oil priced in yuan, but oil exporters hold their profits in bonds, and U.S. Treasury bonds simply pay better interest. End of story. Second, the Belt and Road. China's been literally subsidizing its own currency's adoption in places like Kenya, absorbing massive lending losses, which is the exact opposite of how a dominant currency organically grows. Third, CIPS. The volume is tiny, but worse, it still largely relies on the Western SWIFT system for final routing anyway. Fourth, the digital yuan. Incredibly advanced for sure, but it sparked massive global surveillance fears because nobody wants to hand Beijing their real-time financial data. And finally, gold accumulation. China bought massive amounts of gold, but modern reserve status comes from deep, trusted capital markets, not gold, and besides, gold is still priced in dollars. These are unyielding roadblocks.
Part 3. The Impossible Economic Trilemma. The Physics of Economics. This is where we get to the core macroeconomic reality.
Making a dominant global yuan is structurally impossible without destroying the very foundation of the modern Chinese economy. Economists call this the Impossible Trilemma. It's essentially the laws of physics for macroeconomics. It dictates that a country can only choose 2 of 3 policies: monetary autonomy, a fixed exchange rate, or free capital flows. You absolutely cannot have all 3. This rule simply does not negotiate.
And this principle perfectly illustrates why China is structurally trapped. The U.S. chose monetary autonomy and free capital flows, sacrificing a fixed exchange rate. That means anyone, anywhere can move dollars freely across borders without fear of a government lockdown. That freedom is the bedrock of global trust. China, on the other hand, chose a fixed exchange rate to avoid the kind of domestic currency crises that wrecked Asia back in 1997. They voluntarily gave up free capital flows and maintained strict capital controls. This prevents the yuan from flowing freely enough to ever become a true global reserve. To make the yuan global, China would have to give up its control, and so far they've shown zero interest in taking that risk.
Part 4. The 3 trillion trap, a self-defeating reality.
This brings us to the darkest geopolitical irony of this entire situation.
$3 trillion. China is simultaneously the world's biggest dollar holder and a prisoner inside the very system it's trying to dismantle. They officially hold roughly $3 trillion in U.S. reserves, which means they're literally lending money to America at low interest rates. Plus, it means any attempt by Beijing to rapidly dump those dollars to hurt the U.S. would instantly devalue their own holdings. They would wipe out trillions of their own national wealth overnight.
And to add another layer to this trap, recent authoritative analysis from the Council on Foreign Relations reveals that China hasn't really de-dollarized at all. They've essentially just hidden their massive dollar exposure off the official state balance sheet. They're shifting it into less transparent state banks and investment funds. So they haven't escaped the dollar, they've just moved the furniture around in the same room.
Part 5. The real escape route. Defensive de-dollarization. Realizing they're boxed in, China has actually pivoted its entire strategy. Back in 2022, they watched $300 billion in Russian reserves get frozen by Western sanctions, and Beijing drew a very clear lesson. They are completely vulnerable. So the narrative has fundamentally changed. China's old goal was to replace the dollar entirely, but that's blocked by the Impossible Trilemma. Their actual strategy today is what experts are calling defensive de-dollarization. They are working on building dollar-proof parallel infrastructure, and frankly, they're having some success with it. They're setting up swap lines with over 30 central banks, not to take over the world, but simply to survive a future scenario where they might get cut off from SWIFT. So, if China's structural limits prevent them from directly destroying the dollar's network, it forces us to ask a highly provocative question. If it isn't China, what actually is the biggest threat to the US dollar today?
Well, ironically, the most severe threat to the US dollar is actually America itself. The dollar's absolute dominance relies entirely on trust in U.S. institutions and the safety of U.S. debt. But when you look at recent internal pressures, unprecedented attacks on Federal Reserve independence, the dollar hitting 4-year lows in early 2026, a massive gold surge past $5,500 an ounce as investors panic for safety, and eroding global confidence in U.S. debt, you start to see the cracks. Internal political turbulence is beginning to shake the world's trust from the inside out. Reporting from CNN really highlights the exact opening China is waiting for. As the analysis points out, internal political dynamics and shifting economic policies in the U.S. create significant geopolitical uncertainty, which naturally drives investors to seek safe havens. Listen, China cannot destroy the dollar from the outside. But if American politics inadvertently weakens the dollar's institutional trust from the inside, while China is perfectly positioned to offer a stable alternative bunker for countries looking to hedge their bets. And because China has fundamentally changed its approach from replacing the dollar to merely surviving without it, a multipolar financial reality is already taking root in the shadows. Make no mistake, the dollar is not going to be replaced tomorrow, or even next year. But that old world, the one where the dollar was the absolute, unquestioned only option, yeah, that world is ending.
Which leaves us with a staggering final thought to ponder. 20 years, trillions of dollars, and the yuan sits at just 2% of global reserves. But China changed the question. They stopped asking how to replace the dollar and started asking how to survive without it. So, who will ultimately win this bizarre race between America's internal institutional turbulence and China's defensive financial bunker? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the consensus and keep learning. Catch you next time.